Liza Jane, anything you want to add before we get started?
Nope, just good morning. It's so good to see everyone.
Great. And Maida, in terms of logistics for the meeting, anything from that you would want to add?
No, we'll have Courtney manage the public comment conversation. And then I think our plan this morning is just to jump right into the staff report and presentation.
Sounds great. And I do want to welcome those members of the public that are watching this live via YouTube. Thanks for joining us this morning. So with that, we'll go right into public comment. We don't have any verbal public comment, but Courtney is going to go ahead and cover the written public comment for us. So Courtney.
Yes, good morning, co-chair. So I'll let you guys know we do have 4 attendees listening in via Zoom, and we are being recorded live and streaming live on YouTube this morning. We received 3 public comments by the 5 p.m. deadline on Wednesday, which I emailed out to all of you. One is from the Oregon Invasive Species Council, one is from the Western Invasive Species Network, and one is from Public at Large, Justin Cooley. All were just addressing the importance of weed treatment as part of our fire response grants. And as Eric and Maida will mention later during their presentation, weed treatment is an eligible activity under the implementation portion of these grants. Any questions? I do want to provide just one addition, and that was on the last public comment. There was the question, and we'll be talking about it as a part of our presentation about if we start going down this path of fire funding, do we begin to cannibalize other programs? Like the example was the weed grant program and others. So we will definitely speak specifically to that piece. All right. Jason, you're on mute.
And I'm on mute. We'll go ahead and move to agenda item B, which is the wildfire grant discussion. Maida and Eric?
All right. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen now. Hold on just a second. We do have a PowerPoint presentation for you this morning that we will run through. Eric and I will jump into that now. So what we're going to do is just walk through basically a lot of the information that you see in the staff report. Our plan is to allow time for questions and answers after we're done, which is a little bit easier without the PowerPoint up on the screen. So I'll start and just give a little bit of background and context. This is approaching this conversation in the way that we're doing today is new and different for us. And there are a number of reasons that we are moving forward with this conversation. First is just the scale, of course, of the fires in Oregon. Over 1 million acres burned, largest natural disaster in Oregon's history. We, in the past, have tested this approach, as you'll see in the bullet points, at a very small scale using some of the governor's priority funding. So we do have some experience, and there are some lessons that we learned in the way we provided funding in the past that we've adjusted with this offering. You all expressed some interest in September as we were meeting while the fires were still burning and the smoke was still in the air. And at that point in time, one of the things that I relayed is the concern that we have is that if we were to do full funding for fire restoration across the state of Oregon, it would eat OWEB's budget and we wouldn't come anywhere near to the needs on the ground. The scale is just beyond belief. And honestly, we've talked about that even with one fire in the state, the OWEB restoration program, our grant funding just isn't built for fire recovery at the scale that's needed. However, that doesn't mean that our funding can't be useful. And so we went to work after the September board meeting. We've been meeting extensively with state and federal partners. As a matter of fact, Renee is co-convening a task force for natural and cultural resource recovery with DEQ and Department of Forestry. I'm co-leading an executive level conversation with Department of Forestry. So we've been meeting weekly with our state and federal partners. In part, we started those conversations to figure out what is the funding out there and what are the gaps. so that we knew that if OWEB was inserting funding, we would be inserting it in a way that wasn't filling a role that another agency was already filling. And then we held a series of listening sessions with our local stakeholders, including tribes, conservation districts, land trust, and watershed councils, and others who they invited to the conversation to really hear what their needs were on the ground in terms of immediate response. We do have a limited budget, right? We've stopped a number of granting programs. We paused and moved back our open solicitation cycle. We are still in a limited budget situation. I want to be very clear about that. That said, both, while for our grant fund, our October distribution was down at about 40% of what we typically get. That was higher than what we expected, which was more like in the low 20s for what we expected we would get. So we exceeded, even though our revenues were low in August, we exceeded what we had assumed in the budget. And we just got our November forecast. We had assumed November would be at about 65%, and it is at 80% of what we expected. So again, we are not back to where we were. We still have a limited budget, but in the spending plan that we put before you in June, we are in better shape than we were. If we were not, we would probably be having a different conversation about whether we would be bringing this funding proposal before you. So why OWEB? To be clear, for the both you all and the folks who have paid really close attention to our funding sources, this is a widespread crisis. It has incredible impacts to fish and wildlife habitat, water quality. That is our core function as an agency. We and our local partners need a quick response to this crisis that's in a meaningful way and within our budget constraints. So we were really, really careful to think about, if we didn't have that much funding to provide out, how do we provide it in a way that makes sense for local grantees? One of the questions that came up as we were walking through this earlier this month earlier in the month with the Coordinating Council, which, by the way, is the new name for the Executive Committee. We'll be talking about that more in December. One of the questions was, what were the objectives we would be shooting for? And so we spent some time with that, and really our two objectives are to invest in local organizations to respond to short-term fire recovery needs in a way that benefits long-term restoration. So the things that we do now ought to be able to set the stage for future restoration, and then also to fill those short-term gaps that aren't available through other funding sources. So in terms of the stages of response and recovery, the first thing, of course, is to get the fires out. We have amazing partners at Department of Forestry, U.S. Forest Service, the tribes, Bureau of Land Management, counties, cities, and others who really stepped up and did an amazing job to manage and get those fires out for the immediate term. So then what comes next is an extensive work on assessments, both on federal and non-federal lands, and then the early stabilization activities. That's followed, and we need to be clear that what we are talking about is a long-term endeavor. Post-fire recovery is years out. But that quick stabilization work and the assessments have to happen immediately. Our federal partners at BLM and the Forest Service have done a great job of getting their respective assessments out. FEMA is gathering local and statewide expertise now and proceeding on the non-federal assessments in the short term. I'll just put a star there because that need for local assistance for FEMA is one of the things we'll be talking about in terms of being able to pay grantees to help do that work in partnership with FEMA. Our response funding proposal really focuses in on the assessments and the early stabilization. We recognize that our open solicitation program is really the best place for post-fire recovery conversations, and we've already had our grantees letting us know that some of the long-term priorities that they've set in place in terms of restoration will need to shift because of the scale of these fires. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric now, and he's going to walk through the eligibility for the program. And then at the end of the eligibility, he'll also talk about the process, and then we will open it up for any questions from the board.
Right, thanks, Maida. taking into consideration the factors that Maida discussed in terms of addressing the short-term needs. We're looking at the geography and as you know, the nature of the fire was such that it burned some pretty extensive areas. And in looking through the burn area maps and the data that we had, we developed this list of 14 fires that would be eligible for these grants. These are fires that suffered from moderate to high burn severity and burned at least 500 acres of land. And in terms of what would be eligible for these short-term funds, the eligible land would include private land, excluding industrial forest. And the reason for that is that there are resources from the federal level that are addressing these short-term needs on federal land. Areas identified as a high priority in an ETART assessment, and that is the erosion threat assessment response team work that is being coordinated through FEMA. And that work is looking at the burn severity maps and then identifying priorities where we've got some immediate post-fire stabilization needs that need to be addressed. Other assessments may be eligible, but we'd like to discuss those with the grantees first to make sure that we're indeed addressing needs that should be addressed. We've heard from many experts that there are times and situations where, for example, it might not make sense to go in with seeding efforts in a particular area because either the seed will get washed away or it might be too late for it to germinate or other factors that would limit the effectiveness of that kind of work. So we want to make sure that we're addressing the areas that the funds really are needed to address these 3 to 9 month impacts that Maida described. Let's go to the next slide. And in terms of eligibility, we discussed this quite a bit internally because of the short-term nature of the work that we want to have done, the need for coordination in the areas because there are many organizations that are working to address these needs, and we want to make sure that that those entities are coordinating with each other. And so in terms of who can apply, it's local organizations and tribes. And within each of the 14 fire areas, we would like to provide the funds, we're recommending providing the funds to one designated lead entity in each fire area. And as confirmation of that, as part of the application, which is a pretty streamlined and simplified one, which we'll get into in a minute, the application would need to include just a confirmation email from partners in that fire area indicating the choice of lead entity. And OWEB staff are available and can help facilitate conversations among entities where that's needed to make sure that, we're coordinated and everyone understands roles and partnerships in these areas. One thing I'll point out here is that where you've got a couple of organizations that really should be taking the lead on certain types of work within the same fire area, the lead entity can simply provide funding to that partner organization as a contracted service in the grant. And funding cap based on our revenue situation that Maida described, we wanted to keep within our means here, and so limiting the total expenditure to just under $1 million comes out to $70,000 maximum grant per fire. Let's go to the next slide. We talked also quite a bit internally about what types of implementation actions could be eligible for these funds. And as we talked through this and looked at what are the true short-term needs, we wanted to make sure that we were addressing the needs that had to be addressed within that 3 to 9 month period, because actions that really are required farther out than that or could happen farther out than that, we can address through our normal open solicitation programs, which, while we all understand that they have been significantly altered during the revenue reduction period caused by the COVID pandemic, we are looking to a more normalized operation next biennium where we can go back to hopefully offering open solicitation grants every 6 months. And so those longer term actions can be addressed in that way. And so we're looking at the kinds, yes.
Just real quick, Mark had his hand raised, so I'm not sure if it's about a specific slide that's here. So I want to just catch and see if he has a question now.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Could you go back one slide? Yeah, how did the 70,000 grant max determine? I don't know if you're going to talk about that later, but how did that figure, how did you derive that figure?
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. It was a combination of things. The main one being, as you know, we're living within our means here, operating kind of on a checkbook basis. And so looking at the cash that we have on hand and what we're expected to receive in the rest of the biennium, recognizing that we currently have an open solicitation cycle that we're evaluating right now and will be coming to the board for funding recommendations in the spring. We want to make sure that we're keeping that open solicitation cycle robust and keeping within the limits of funds on hand, funding on hand. We wanted to keep the total expenditure right at about $1 million as the maximum. Okay. And then in terms of the max grant per fire, because we're not, we won't really know the extent of the short-term needs until we see these applications, but wanting to make sure that each burned area had access to funds, we decided to have a $70,000 maximum for each of the 14, so that if everybody applied for the maximum, we'd be at that $1 million limit.
Thanks. And if I might note just one additional thing here, that we did hold a meeting with the local organizations in the fires after we came up with this proposal. So we met with them about a week and a half ago to walk through this concept with them and just get feedback. And both the 70,000 max, that was one of our questions, and they were comfortable with that amount given the types of practices we're talking about. I'm sure they would also be comfortable with a higher amount. But when we asked specifically if this was enough money worth applying for, they were very comfortable that it was. The other piece I'll just mention, the nice thing about this structure on this page that Eric mentioned is it means we don't have people competing against each other within each fire. And so we will have a grant from the Riverside fire, for example, and that the local grantees can know that as long as it meets the technical requirements, meets the assessments, all of those kinds of things, it's not going through a competition, it's going through a review to make sure that it meets all of the criteria that it needs to, which really helps to alleviate some of that, having organizations within a fire competing against each other.
Okay, and so on the short-term implementation actions, the first bullet there, this is something that a lot of the organizations that we work with have been already working on and talking about with their partners in the burned areas. There obviously are going to be a lot of burned logs immediately available. You know, if you've noticed log transportation in your area, if you're near one of the burn areas, you've already seen a lot of charred logs on trucks and trains coming out of the burned areas. And so that means there could be a large availability of logs that could be used in future restoration projects. And this is a type of project that we have funded in the past, where organizations are taking advantage of the availability of logs at one point in time, knowing that they can use them for restoration projects in the future. And the key here is funding is needed for transporting, grading, and stockpiling those logs and having a place to store them. And so we wanted to make that activity eligible so that our grantee organizations can take advantage of the current situation and have that resource available for future use. And then the second category of practices here, you may have heard that NRCS opened up on very short order a cost share practice in an emergency situation for eligible cooperators in Farm Bill programs to implement stabilization needs post-fire. And they had a list of eligible practices there, which includes the first 6 on this list. And in talking with our grantees in our listening sessions, we heard in several places that there are landowners that have similar needs that are not eligible for the NRCS programs in terms of immediate stabilization. And it's typically to just simply get areas stabilized that are critical to be stabilized for purposes of water quality protection, or if there's some resource immediately downslope that needs to be protected. The final practice on their fencing, that is not one that was included in the NRCS emergency granting, but in our listening sessions, we did hear that there was extensive damage to livestock fencing, and there's a connection there to prior OWEB funded restoration investment in riparian areas that could be damaged due to the lack of fencing if cattle continue to have access to those areas. So we decided to include fencing in that list of eligible practices. And the last one there, we wanted to make sure that if there were some immediate stabilization needs that grantees could make a good case for, but that were not covered in the other actions that I mentioned, that we wanted to have the ability and a placeholder for that. But we do want to make sure that there's a qualifying assessment that has prioritized that work. And we want to make sure that we had some discussion in advance with OWEB staff to make sure that we're addressing needs that fit the criteria we've established for the program. So let me pause there before I get into the other eligible actions and see if there are any questions.
So go ahead and use the raise hand function, and Maida's got access to that, so she'll be able to call individual board members.
Yeah, so Barbara?
Hi there. Maybe you said this, but I didn't capture it. What are the numbers passed after each of those practices? Is that NRCS numbers?
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, my apologies for not explaining that. Those are the references to the NRCS field guide for practices. And you can find that field guide online if you Google NRCS Oregon conservation practices.
All right, we have Jamie.
Thanks so much for all the work you put into this, and it makes sense given OWEB's charge. My question is thinking of how we're leveraging funds, potentially FEMA funds. So will the assessments include documentation of related activities, specifically those eligible for FEMA funds? Because I'm thinking about the possibility of using this work to help meet the match so we can get additional federal funds.
Yeah. I can.
Go ahead, Maida.
Oh, go ahead, Eric.
No, go ahead.
All right.
Go ahead.
So the E-chart assessments, the FEMA assessments, are going to identify where the need is. They will not specifically say this project is going to be done under individual funding or the public funding, but it will say this is where those needs are. We have been in conversations with Department of Forestry to figure out if this funding will be eligible for match. So Jamie, that is our goal. If it can be identified, it definitely will be. And I'm not sure, Renee, if that that conversation has been finalized about whether these are eligible for match or if that's still up in the air.
Thanks. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director, still waiting for final word from FEMA that things are looking somewhat positive, that our grants to local partners, if they do engage in assessments, may be able to be used as match to FEMA.
All right, I don't see any other hands raised, so Eric, we'll go to the next slide.
Okay, yes, and before we take the next point, I just wanted to acknowledge a comment in the chat from Brenda about from a human standpoint. Of course, the fires are catastrophic. However, from an ecological standpoint, these mixed severity fires are unusual in their size, but not unprecedented, and that we need to consider the ecological benefits of fire as well. And thank you for the link that you included there, Brenda. And there actually was a very informative webinar just yesterday that the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils put on with Gordon Reeves discussing that very topic. And with a lot of research and data behind it, showing the long-term value for fish habitat specifically of wildfires. And that, of course, is something we'll need to keep in mind. I think that when we conducted the listening sessions, we heard quite a bit about water quality impacts that need to be addressed. And I mentioned the issue with livestock damaging prior investment in riparian areas. And so those are the kinds of things we're hoping to address here. And I think the longer term restoration type projects we're not going to see in response to this offering. We may see some in response to open solicitation offerings in the future. So in addition to the implementation activities we discussed, we also wanted to make available funding for engagement activities in post-fire response. And we heard quite a bit about this as well in our listening sessions with the grantees. And it really does fall under two other categories of grant types that OWEB typically offers. The first one there is stakeholder engagement. And there already has been a lot of work from our grantees to secure landowner buy-in and coordinate on post-fire restoration actions. And then in the realm of technical assistance, we've been talking about assessments, the ETART process run by FEMA. FEMA had put out a call for technical experts with localized knowledge to help them do these assessments in the burn areas. And we wanted to make sure that funding wasn't a barrier for any of our grantees to have their staff participate on those assessment teams. And so we wanted to make that assessment work eligible for reimbursement under this post-fire response grant process. So any questions on the engagement activities that are eligible?
Okay. Don't see any.
All right, let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about process. So in terms of how we structured this, we wanted to do something that is similar in approach in some respects to our small grant program. And a lot of kudos here to Kathy Leopold on our staff, who's our small grant program coordinator, who pretty quickly put a draft application together in that spirit, using more or less a checklist-based approach to the application. And in that checklist approach, it references the specific practices that you saw in the earlier slide, and has some simple narrative responses too, so applicants can explain their work. And as we mentioned earlier, there would be just one organization per fire applying, along with a confirmation email from other partners in that fire area. And in terms of technical review, which, as you all know, is an important part of our process for every grant offering we have, we want to make sure we're doing that. However, we don't want to add significant time to the process. We want to get from application to grant agreements fairly quickly. And so that technical review will be done internally by OWEB staff. We'll be calling upon our regional program representatives to help review the applications that come in and work with our applicants if there's any follow-up needed on the specifics of the applications. And then the final points here, we wanted to make sure that while this is a streamlined offering with fairly low administrative effort, that we do have some feedback and reporting on how the funds were used. And so we're going to ask for feedback at the end of the project on how the funds were beneficial, and whether or not the work that was completed supported disproportionately impacted communities, and also reporting on the hiring of minority and women-owned contractors and businesses. And I wanted to turn it over to Maida there for some additional comment on that.
Yeah, so two pieces on that. One piece, the reason, and this is going back to what Eric described at the beginning about the things that can be applied for, the reason that it works for the review to be internal by OWEB staff is we have an amazing partner agency in NRCS who has the design standards that sit behind those numbers that Eric identified. So when we look at the practices will come from an assessment. They will be the standards that NRCS has. So it makes that process a lot easier than our typical restoration grant review. And so as we need to potentially reach out to other agencies, we will, but given kind of that, as Eric mentioned, the checklist nature of that, it makes the review process a little bit more simplified. And then on the how funds were used piece, as we mentioned before, we have, in limited circumstances, provided grants out through the governor's priority funds in the past, just a couple of them down in Southwest Oregon, up in Wasco County. These fires like these are likely to continue in the future. And so what we really want to find out with that first bullet is feedback to you as a board. If in the future there is a set aside that you want to do for natural resource disaster response, is the type of offering that we just provided here helpful? Because if it is, or if it is with some quick changes, we can be talking to you about that as a part of spending plan conversations. And instead of having the time it took us to design the program this time, we can respond more quickly in the future if this is the type of program that you as a board see as beneficial and that our grantees see as beneficial. So if they come back and say, actually, this didn't work, this approach didn't work, thanks for trying, but really the funding that we need is different, then there's no reason for us to try to set up something like this in the future if it wasn't something that actually helped the resource and the grantees. So we'll be bringing that feedback to you all after completion of the program. And then also, again, the focus here is on the resource, but we know within the resource, there are disproportionately impacted communities within those wildfires. That's part of why we're focusing this on private non-industrial lands. And also the opportunity where possible to hire minority and women-owned contractors and businesses. We've relayed that already to our grantees so that they know that that is an important piece. And we want to get a report back. That gives us kind of the first phase. This is a great opportunity for us to understand how those networks work and how we were able to address either those communities or hiring of contractors and businesses. We are one piece of the fire recovery. So just a reminder, there's a housing piece, there's an infrastructure piece, there's a debris removal piece. There are a number of other functions who are also making sure that as we're looking at housing, we're looking at disproportionately impacted communities, et cetera. So this can feed into that conversation across the state recovery functions. And I think we are now to the point of, oh yeah, go ahead, Eric.
There is a comment in the chat box from Jamie about does the reporting out on hiring include tribal contractors and businesses?
Yes, absolutely. Other questions that folks have, we're now to the question space. And so what I'll do is stop the screen sharing right now so that we can get everybody back up on screen and see what questions or comments you have at this point in time.
And Debbie
has her hand raised, and then Steve.
Thanks. See if I can lower my hand and unmute myself at the same time. Apparently not.
I got your hand for you.
Okay, thank you. So I potentially have some good news to share, or I have an interesting question. So according to everything I know about Thielsen, which is not everything by any sense of the word, but I think it is 100% on National Forest System land. I do not believe Thielsen crossed out of the National Forest and onto private land. And so as such, I would recommend that we would delete that one from the list of eligible fires. And that would give us $75,000 per fire instead of 70.
I'm gonna have Renee, who's been engaged in this, respond. And Renee, your thoughts on that?
Thanks for that feedback, Debbie. We were waiting for final ownership numbers from Department of Forestry. So pending that, and given the intent for these funds to be used on private non-industrial lands, if that does end up to be the case, then we could make that adjustment.
And I think we could make an adjustment to the motion when made that would speak, if the board is comfortable with that, we can also adjust the motion so that basically when the final numbers come back, if Thielsen is only on federal, we would up the amount to 75,000. Let's see, I have Steve, and then Gary, Mark, and Paul.
Yeah, I was just curious about the partners. Have they already been identified and agreed to the lead partner?
The partners are generally known in the local areas. They have not agreed to who the lead partner would be. We did give this presentation to them last week. And told them that that would be the process that we would be using. In some areas, it is very obvious who the local partner is. In others, they have good conversations, and so they're working on that. In others, we have offered OWEB facilitation assistance if they need it, where those fires might cross county boundaries or have other issues. So we've offered to help facilitate. The key that Eric raised, I think, is important, that there's one lead applicant, but that doesn't mean that other partners can't receive funding from the program. So if the tribe is the best person to provide the biological resource for an assessment, for example, but the tribe chooses not to be the lead applicant, the tribe can still receive funding for that component. So I think that will help. The lead applicant role is more of a fiscal management role. And the key is to make sure that the groups have come together and decided on what the most important things are. And once that's decided, then it just becomes a role of who wants to fiscally manage the grant. But that is not decided. We also have not set a deadline for this application. All funds must be spent by the end of June. Again, we want this to be a short-term response. But if they need until January or December to actually get together what they want to do, that's fine. We'll take the application whenever it comes. So now I'm going to go to Gary.
Maybe you just answered my question. I just want to know when the end date this was, and you said they planned on having it all spent by June. So, but beyond that, when do you see us starting to distribute funds if this is approved today?
We are going to, and part of the motion that will be in front of you today is to date those, the grants back to August 15th. So as long as they're doing something we're doing something that was within an assessment, they can actually charge backwards. And as soon as grantees have applications in, we are planning to review them every week as they come in, and we can turn grant agreements around very quickly. So it's basically as quickly as they get applications into us, we can respond with a review, a grant agreement, and then moving forward. All right, Mark.
Well, a comment and a question. So the comment is that, and I fully realize that there are some folks probably listening or online who have provided public comment that would say, you know, we're already in a fiscal crisis with OWEB funding, and that we need to make sure that we honor our current grantees and future grantees in this. But because of what you said earlier, Maida, which I totally agree with, this is an unprecedented situation in Oregon's history, and we're probably going to have more of these in the future. And for us to step up to the plate in an emergency like this, and I consider this an emergency that does affect fish and wildlife, ecosystems, and other habitats, I think this is an appropriate area where OWEB can step forward. And I can't compliment staff enough. I mean, to put this program together in a very short period of time, the devil's in the detail, of course, and we don't want to just rush into things. We want to make sure that we try to do this right. And that I think that there will probably be some missteps along the way as we move through this process, but I think we're making the effort. We'll learn from this. And so when the disaster in the future comes and we can step up to the plate as essentially a government entity that moved quickly to address an emergency situation, I can't compliment staff enough for that work on that. So the question I have is kind of back to Debbie's comment. So there are fires that are heavily federal burned acres, and there are fires that are heavily private acres that were burned. And so it's not across the board. And we've allocated $70,000 or $75,000 across the board. So if there are fires that the application or the applicant that comes in says, well, we've only got 10% of the fires is on private lands that qualify for eligible funding, and they only ask for $35,000. Is the criteria the limit of $1 million for all now 13 fires, or is the criteria of $70,000 or $75,000 per fire? So in other words, if there's money left over and we've got one that's 80% private burned acres that qualify, can they ask for more money, or is the maximum just the 70 to 75, where another fire only asks for $10,000? If that made sense.
So, yes, Mark, you are channeling the local grantee questions that came up. So the motion that we put in front of you today is for $1 million for this program and delegating the authority to the director to distribute grant funds. The conversation that we've had with the grantees is the $70,000 max, and they asked the exact same question that you did. What our response was, because the overall allocation is $1 million, there is a possibility that we could do some shifting around of funds. It becomes incredibly challenging, because how do you then decide, is it the Riverside Fire or the Beachy Fire or Open Chain or 242? How you decide how that gets shifted is going to be a challenge. And so what we asked our grantees, again, having you guys do the $1 million and letting us then distribute that through a director's delegation, which is a pretty typical process, so we don't have to come back to you for approval of each grant. It does allow us the flexibility, Mark, to do what you said, but we're going to have to be really thoughtful about how it's done, so that we don't end ourselves up in a spot that we have 10 of the 14 coming back and needing an extraordinary additional amount of money. So our goal would be to keep it at that $70,000 or $75,000, and then to have some really clear conversations with grantees before we would move forward to exceed that, so that we don't get ourselves in a spot where we have we end up back in that competition phase. So if we can figure out an equitable way to do that, we definitely will. We have not figured it out yet, but I certainly don't want to close the door if, as we move forward, we figure out a good way to do that work. And your motion will allow for that flexibility.
Okay. Yeah, I should have known you've already thought this through. So.
Well, we've been asked it.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, and then Debbie, I saw your hand pop up again. No, okay. Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everybody. To some extent, actually, I had a similar question to what Mark asked, but I'll also throw another bit of information on the table, and then maybe we can think about how it might play into this program moving forward. And that is, there's obviously other efforts going on, similar to this or with other entities. And the one I'll mention that I got asked about 2 days ago in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have a science applications program. It's a nationwide program. We got regional leads. Our regional lead here for Oregon and Washington, Idaho is Jim Unsworth, who some of you might know. He used to run Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's our science applications program lead now. And he called me because he's getting some offers from our national office about funding to do scientific work on these fires. And also he was coordinating with Northern California. And I was wondering what the potential is for leveraging these funds, or, sort of dovetailing, like someone referenced some of the ecological aspects, beneficial aspects of the fires, and, documenting or accounting for those things. And that's what our folks are interested in as well. And so maybe there is an opportunity, and they've got about $1 million also for this, is what I understand right now, and it could be more. Is there a way of, obviously this is moving pretty fast, this is good. Could we have some, avenue for leveraging other entities' dollars to build on these I like the way it's organized by individual fire, but so I'm looking at how we could bring more money to some of these projects. For example, if it's a restoration project, well, what's the long-term monitoring of that project? And we could maybe kick in something on that end from the agency perspective. Yeah. So just ideas like that. I don't know if Eric or others have, or if that came up in discussion with grantees, but my feeling is there's going to be other people who want to be involved in this and might bring some.
I might turn that actually to Renee, because part of the structure of the task force includes a monitoring component. So Renee, do you want to speak a little bit to that and maybe some opportunities there?
Certainly, thanks, Maida. So Paul, it's helpful. It's incredibly helpful to know that because as part of the overarching structure, we have a natural and cultural resources recovery task force that has been convened, spanning work from more of this kind of near-term stabilization, completion of the assessments, but out much longer term through 1 to 5 year recovery. And part of that conversation, as Maida mentioned, is an interagency research and monitoring team that is, has been identified by name, the details of which are still to be worked out. But I think the program that you reference is exactly the type of resource that we need to know about as we're having these interagency task force conversations around not only how do we invest in recovery, restoration, but how can we learn from this? So I certainly will take that information to that table and we can have an offline conversation about that. But I also think as projects begin flowing in, likely through open solicitation is my guess, which could include some monitoring projects to look at post-fire effects, it's going to be critically important to make sure that we're well coordinated with federal partners who have national programs such as the one that you just mentioned to really maximize that leverage.
Okay, so I'll just, maybe I can get Jim to actually join some subset of this, maybe with Eric and you and others who are leading it, and he can, speak directly to the potential for leveraging or adding to these projects.
That would be great. Great, thank you. All right, I'm gonna, Brenda had a question in the chat. Brenda, I'll have you go ahead and ask that question, and then Randy, and then Liza Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Maida. To your point about engaging with women and minority-owned businesses, I wondered to what degree traditional ecological knowledge as a component of an application might be considered in an approval process.
Thanks for the question, Brenda. And I think absolutely that's one of our goals in bringing the tribes, both tribes and, as Jamie mentioned, tribal contractors into the conversation. Because we're not scoring these applications, it wouldn't be something that, again, the application for the fire that meets the criteria will be moved forward, but that is definitely something that we can relay back, and I think of a strong interest to our local grantees as well. So we will make sure to relay that is of interest to the board if folks are okay with that. I think it's critical not only for this, but honestly moving forward for our restoration projects in the future. I think, these are quick response. We really need to pay attention as we're moving forward restoration projects to the opportunity for traditional ecological knowledge to build into those fire projects. So thank you for raising that. Randy.
Yeah, just,
and then Liza Jane.
Just a small point. I would hope we could coordinate with some of the conservation groups on this, because they often have, or have in the past, have supporters who are interested in fire recovery help in specific areas. So let's be sure we communicate with those organizations.
Thank you for that reminder, Randy, and we will absolutely make sure to do that. And if you have specific suggestions, let us know. Liza Jane.
Thank you, Maida. Back to those NRCS, the Conservation Stewardship Program activities. In participating in that program, all those different activities have different weight, is what they say. And so I'm wondering if thinking about short-term recovery needs having long-term impacts, will the staff kind of consider that as well? Are you using their weights, or will OWEB have their?
Yeah, so different programs. Thanks, Liza Jane. The Conservation Stewardship Program, you're absolutely right, gives different weights for payments for landowners based on the different practices. And some of the practices are the same as the ones we mentioned here, so there I can understand the confusion. We're using actually Environmental Quality Incentive Program roles. So it's just, if you're doing the practice on the ground and it's a fire recovery related practice, we're gonna do that practice. And so it's not a weighted system like it is for the Conservation Stewardship Program. This is just the list of practices that local grantees can apply that we know meet those particularly soil stabilization is the most critical thing right now. So it's really trying to just say, in the short term, what are the things that we can get on the ground right now that assessments say we should be doing? So there won't be the waiting system like the Conservation Stewardship Program.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, Bruce has his hand up.
Some of the questions I've been hearing, good questions, indicate to me that there might be some sort of competition involved in awarding grants, as far as ranking and looking at certain aspects of them. But as I understand it, there really isn't any competition for these grants. So,
no, that is, Bruce, you're absolutely right. That is our goal. Yeah.
So without any competition for the grants, we have preferences, but we're not going to award or change grants based on our preferences. Is that what I understand? Am I understanding that correctly?
I would put it more in this vein, and then would ask Eric if he wants to provide any additional thoughts. More in terms of a conversation with the grantees. So the nice thing about this, again, we are trying to respond. These are not our restoration grants. We are responding to an immediate need to get soil stabilized, to get weeds managed quickly, right? So that's why it's more of a checklist. What is the thing that the assessment said needed to be done? Where are you going to do it? What kind of money do you need to do it? Or for example, using NRCS's programs, we just need money to get people enrolled in NRCS's programs. So we need some staff time to do that. We need staff time to participate in an assessment. So it's very cut and dried, the things that they can apply for. Within that, though, Bruce, the nice thing about this is we can have a back and forth conversation with the grantees. So if they're saying, you know, we want to do weed management on these acres, and we're looking at the assessment with them, we might have a conversation back saying, hey, you know, for just a little bit more, have you thought about maybe also adding this practice in? Or if they're doing stakeholder engagement, making sure that they're coordinated with the people who have the best access to the landowner. So we'll be able to have some back and forth, but you are absolutely right. Our goal, and this is really important in this, is there's a fire need, there's a soil stabilization need, there's a weed management need, and there's an opportunity to grab some restoration logs for the future. Those things are immediate, and the practices that are used to do that are already based in science. We already know the technical standards. And so really the goal is look at the assessment, tell us what you're going to address in the assessment using these approved practices. And then a lot of the rest of it, like use of it disproportionately impacted communities, focusing efforts there, using minority women-owned businesses, are things we're going to get feedback on this time. But no, those things aren't how we're ranking projects. Those are things that we're going to get a report on so that you all can see. It gives us a good baseline of how folks are using those different resources. And as we move forward in our DEI efforts, this is a great chance to gather some of that data so we know where we're at right now. But Bruce is absolutely right. We are not ranking projects, and if there is a space for conversation, we'll absolutely have that. Eric, did I cover that all right? Or please.
You did. The only thing I'd add to that is that the reason that we listed those practices in the offering, or we will list them in the offering, and then they'd be referenced in the grant agreement, is that they have published technical specifications to them. And so our grantees would be agreeing that they're going to implement these practices in accordance with those technical specifications. Also, we recognize that there may be need for other practices that aren't on that list. And so we basically want to have the conversation and make sure we are having grantees that are following approved technical specs for whatever practice that they're proposing to implement. So we wanted to leave open the opportunity to do that if there are practices that aren't on our approved list.
Barbara and then Tony.
Well, Steph, as always, you amaze me with your quick thinking and getting all this out to us in a swift manner. Thank you. I am curious, I know this is going to be a little more hands-off than our normal grant process, but will there be any additional staff needed for this particular granting cycle?
No, Eric mentioned Kathy Leopold, who is our goddess in terms of putting this program together. And one of the things, we have a system that allows us to put together online grant applications on fairly quick order. It makes the process very streamlined. April will be assisting us with grant agreements and has been working on that process already. But this is a place where we believe, and I keep saying something that Renee said to me early on in the process, these fires are unprecedented. We have an obligation to respond where we can as an agency, and whether that's coordinating some of these groups or providing grant funding, we will make the space in our programs to be able to move that forward. But thank you for asking, Barbara. Tony.
Thanks, Meta. Just wanted to suggest that there, these assessments are really going to be a snapshot in time, right? They're kind of directly done after post-fire. And some flexibility might be needed because the situation could change with follow-on weather events quite rapidly, in fact, because stabilization didn't occur quickly enough. So I was just wanted to suggest that some flexibility in, or maybe even a second stage view of that might be appropriate, just because what we grant out immediately may change quite drastically in very specific situations.
Yeah, Tony, and that's actually, thank you for saying that. That is a part of the reason that we had that bullet at the bottom, that if there are other accepted assessment methods, I can't remember how we worded it, but in some places they aren't, they won't actually even be doing a ETART assessment, FEMA won't, so we're gonna have to depend on other things. And you're right, things can change during the winter in particular. So we definitely are open to, as those things change, being very clear that this is still short term, right? So we are not talking about restoration past 9 months. We are talking about what needs to be done between now and next spring that can be quickly implemented and put on the ground. I know we are getting close to time. I am not seeing additional hands up. I really appreciate the engagement of the board on this. Oh, I see Jamie has her hand up.
Not a question, but if there's no other questions, I'm happy to make a motion, but I also defer to the chairs if one of them wants to make a motion.
Nope, we'd be happy to entertain a motion, Jamie.
Hold on, Debbie has her hand raised real quick. Debbie?
Yeah, thanks, Maida. So just on that last conversation that Tony brought up, and then you validated, that the emphasis is on kind of this first 9-month period, this first winter period. I'm wondering if we need to be more explicit that we're really looking at kind of emergency stabilization actions. I mean, certainly that's what the approved practices are focused on, but I wonder if we want to just be a little more specific, and we may not, right? But if we really do think that we only want this money, or it's only going to functionally work in this first winter period or first winter spring period to be effective, maybe we want to say that.
My only concern, Debbie, I appreciate the feedback. I do think based on the practices, that's fairly clear. And we are also talking about the log storage piece, which is not an emergency stabilization action, and the engagement with landowners. So I think being too specific actually would pull out a couple of the activities that we're proposing that they could do. But we can be incredibly clear, and I think our grantees do understand based on the practices that these are emergency stabilization activities, at least those on the ground ones. So I think we can take care of that in conversation if that's all right.
Yeah, no, that's
so we
fine.
Don't limit those.
Yeah, and I mean, I do really appreciate how you've tried to thread the needle with providing direction and providing flexibility, right? Like there's a fine balance there, and staff always does a very nice job with that. So I'm good. Thank you.
All right, back to Jamie.
So Jamie, do you have a motion to make?
Yes, I just first of all want to say thank you to staff for your quick thinking, giving us this opportunity to consider a timely response to something that's been devastating for our community. So thank you for that. And I also really appreciate Debbie's comments of kind of the overall understanding and intent with this focus on this interim period. But your point's well taken, Maida, to leave some of the flexibility. So with that, I move that the board approve up to $1 million in funding for a short-term wildfire response grant offering, and delegate to the executive director the authority to distribute the funds through appropriate agreements with an award date of August 15th, 2020.
Okay, we have a motion by Jamie. Do we have a second? Bruce, I see, raised his hand. Second by Bruce. Okay. Any further
and we will need folks to come off mute.
Yes.
We've learned. So yeah, go ahead, Jason, with discussion.
Yeah, so if everybody can come off mute. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Jason, could I just ask for one clarification? At one point, staff talked about either 70,000 or up that to 75,000 per grant. Would that be appropriate to include in the motion?
I actually think, Jamie, based on the follow-up conversation that we had about the fact that the $1 million, when we were talking about actually being able to move money later, because what you have approved is the $1 million, if we commit to you that if Thielsen is not in there, we will adjust up that maximum, but it's not part of your motion. So I think we're okay. We understand the intent of the board, and we will also work for ways to flexibly move funds if they're available at the end of the project as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarifying question, Jamie. Anything else before we vote? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you very much. Motion carries. Maida, any next steps?
Next steps, our hope is to get the grant application out fairly quickly within the next week, thanks to the work of Kathy and Eric. And we will be reporting back to you in December as to what we're seeing with this program. And if you have any additional thoughts, please do let us know. We want to make sure that we're running this in an effective manner. So any additional thoughts you have, please let us know. Great. And thank you for joining us on a Friday morning for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maida. Thank you, staff. And thank you, board members, for joining us today. We are adjourned for the day. Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you. Take care.